revision video, and today we'll be looking at types of reproduction and human reproduction. And just to remember that this is a support video. It does not cover every detail in sufficient detail, so you need to revise all content by yourself using your own textbooks and lesson notes. Looking at different types of reproduction. There are two main types of reproduction. Sexual reproduction, which basically leads to variation, genetic variation, involves the fusion of gametes, so egg and sperm, or pollen and egg. It involves a meiosis in creating those gametes. Asexual reproduction doesn't involve the fusion of gametes. It produces genetically identical offspring common in bacteria and plants, and relies on the nuclear division of mitosis. Close look at asexual reproduction. Said before, it has no one parent involved. There's no gametes and no mixing of genetic information. It involves production of genetically identical offspring, and there is no genetic variation as a result. And it's the only type of cell division is mitosis. So organisms that can reproduce asexually include bacteria, fungus, plants, and some animals. And the advantages of sexual reproduction are, if an organism needs to quickly populate a new habitat to ensure it's successful, this will be able to do so. And if it's well adapted to that habitat, it keeps and maintains these successful characteristics for future generations. Bacteria, as you should be aware, can copy themselves extremely quickly, up to every 20 minutes, 10 times faster than the quickest possible animal. And the process is called binary fission, where a bacteria goes from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells and increases exponentially, providing there's enough resources available. Other plants and examples that do this is potato tubers. You might have seen strawberry plants produce what we call runners, and plantlets produced by spiders. That then is sexual reproduction, which is where two parents reproduce. It involves the fusion of male and female gametes to form a zygote, which is a term that you need to be very familiar with, which is the first fertilized cell. And characteristics combine of both parents, leading to genetic variation. And gametes are formed by meiosis. You'll have to look back at the video on cell division in order to watch that. And then the zygote, once it's created, divides by mitosis. In animals, it is sperm and egg cell, and it is pollen replacing the sperm in plants. Some organisms use two different methods. They use both sexual and asexual reproduction. The malaria parasite, or Plasmodium, uses asexual reproduction in human hosts, but sexual reproduction in the mosquito host. Fungus can use a variety, whether it's making spores asexually and sexually to produce various. Do both as well, so they can use pollen to produce sexually, but produce runners such as this strawberry plant here to produce new plantlets asexually. When we do have sexual reproduction, obviously it involves the fusion of gametes. So gametes are haploid due to meiosis, which means they have in humans 23 chromosomes, in the egg 23 in the sperm, and they join via fertilization, and that gives them a full diploid set of 46 chromosomes, and only one sperm fuses with the egg, as we will look at in this video. Focus on that. Let's focus on human reproduction moving forward. We need to know about adaptations of the sperm and the egg. So both of those are haploid cells. They both in humans contain 23 chromosomes. But if we look closely at the egg cell is adapted to only being fertilized by one sperm. And if we start off from the inside out, I suppose, if we start here, we have this inner layer of a jelly coat called the zona pellucida. And this is a layer of glycoproteins containing something called ZP3, which is what the sperm are able to attach to, and is later chemically altered to prevent further sperm entering the egg after the first one enters. Also, we have on here something called binding proteins, which allow the sperm to bind, and we have something called cortical granules as well, these blue bits here. And the cortical granules are vesicles of enzymes near the plasma membrane of the sperm released into the zona pellucida. So once the sperm enter here, these blue circles contain enzymes that are released near where the sperm is released, making the zona pellucida then become impenetrable for future sperm entry. Obviously have other adaptations. They have a lot of yolk, okay, and that is stores of lipids and other food to allow the egg to survive until implantation once it's been fertilized, and mitochondria, which obviously provides ATP, and that mitochondria will become all the future mitochondria moving forward. So you inherit your mitochondria from your mother directly, and they have their own DNA, so they can divide separately. And we also in this cell have centrioles, which are obviously essential in mitosis. The sperm cell is obviously a lot smaller, and it is adapted to get to the egg. So it has a tail, which we might also call the flagellum, and that has what we call 9+2 formula of microtubules, which beat, making a forward motion as you would expect. It has a mid-piece in here which contains all the mitochondria, which obviously release ATP, allowing the movement of the flagellum so the sperm can get to the egg. And we have a streamlined head, tightly packed due to the small cytoplasm. So it has a nucleus, which obviously has 23 chromosomes, and then the acrosome, which has the enzymes allowing it to get into the egg. It also, however, has receptors that are complementary to the ZP3 glycoproteins in the zona pellucida of the egg that we just mentioned. And we said the acrosomes basically have enzymes that can digest the proteins and polysaccharides in the zona pellucida to reach the plasma membrane of the egg. It has binding proteins which attach to the plasma membrane of the egg, allowing the Now, we should also be aware of the different parts of the male reproductive anatomy. So we need to know the following areas and what they do. So the penis, which obviously penetrates the vagina for ejaculation of sperm near the cervix. The scrotum, which is a bag of skin that holds the testes at temperature lower than core body temperature, allowing the successful production of sperm. The semivesicle and prostate gland adds alkaline protein and fructose to the sperm to make semen, and the sperm duct transfers sperm during ejaculation, when the testes is obviously where testosterone is made and sperm is produced. We also have something called the epididymis, which is, I suppose, this layer here, and this is where the sperm is stored until ejaculation. We then have the female parts of the reproductive system. So the ovaries are where the eggs are made and produces estradiol, which we'll talk about, and progesterone. We then have the oviduct, which is this part here, obviously two oviducts, one here as well, which is where the eggs are collected from ovulation, and it's where the site of fertilization would occur sort of here-ish. And then moves using cilia, the zygote, towards the uterus. So this bit here is the uterus, providing the needs of the embryo during pregnancy, and the egg will obviously implant in the uterus. We then have the cervix, which protects the uterus during pregnancy and dilates, which means it opens up, giving birth, allowing the baby to come out. We then have the vagina, which stimulates the penis to cause ejaculation, and it acts as a birth canal, and then the vulva, which protects the internal parts of the female reproductive system. If we look first of all at the menstrual cycle, because this is obviously involved in creating or releasing a mature egg. So it occurs in women from puberty to menopause unless pregnancy or ill health, and it is involved in the changes in the uterus, which are regulated by of different stages. Day 1 to 14 is the follicular phase even, and this is where multiple eggs mature in the follicles in the ovaries, and the most developed follicle then is broken open, called ovulation. The other follicles created and mature degenerate. We then go to the luteal phase, which is where the walls of the follicle turn into corpus luteum. If fertilization doesn't occur, this breaks down and ovarian ovaries return back to the follicle stage. A little bit more of a look at this. We've said multiple eggs mature in the follicle stage, and the most developed one is released, and this is the follicle here. So the what we call the corpus luteum is created, which releases the follicle, and then if it isn't pregnant, you basically degenerate and restart again. In terms of the lining, the endometrium lining is shed on day 1, so we're talking about the uterus lining here, which is called the period. And following this period, the lining starts to rebuild on day 1 to 14, and in the luteal stage, at day 14 to 28, the endometrium becomes thick and more rich blood supply in preparation for implantation of a fertilized egg, but then it breaks down towards the end of the stage again. So you need to know the different events that happen in both the follicular stage and the luteal stage, in both the ovaries and in the uterus. And then when we get to if fertilization does occur, so if we go through the stages here, we start off with stage 1 here. The sperm makes contact with the egg, so it will come into contact with a Z-free glycoprotein. Number 2, the acrosome then reacts with the zona pellucida, so it releases the enzymes to break down those glycoproteins and proteins in there using hydrolytic enzymes. That will then enter something called the perivitelline space, which we don't need to know that much detail, and the plasma membrane of the egg and the sperm fuse, so the nucleus of the sperm enters the egg cytoplasm, and then cortical granules fuse with the egg plasma membrane, which renders the layer impenetrable. So remember, these contain enzymes that can merge with the zona pellucida, making it impermeable as a result. So if 2 sperm enter the egg, we know it causes a triploid zygote, which would be aborted, it would die. So we need to just be aware that this acrosome reaction is really important. So enzymes in the acrosome are released when the sperm binds to the specific glycoprotein of the zona pellucida. This digests the glycoproteins, weakening the zona pellucida, and the beating of the sperm tail generates enough force to push the sperm into the plasma membrane of the egg. Called the cortical reaction, which is when we prevent future sperm entering. So the cortical reactions are when thousands of enzymes, my pen's not working, thousands of enzymes containing vesicles located near the cell plasma membrane. As the sperm enters the egg, these cortical granules move towards the membrane and release contents by exocytosis. This toughens the zona pellucida, making it more difficult for more sperm to enter, and the enzymes change the specific glycoproteins in the zona pellucida, so the ZP3 proteins change, so that the sperm can no longer bind. So not only does it prevent the entry of the sperm into the egg cytoplasm, it also prevents the binding to the ZP3 glycoprotein. Fertilization occurs, now we need to look at puberty and also the production of sperm in spermatogenesis and the production of eggs in oogenesis. We look at puberty and how that is controlled. Puberty is obviously the development of childhood to adulthood. So it's the developmental changes that allow the body to transition from a child to an adult, so you're able to reproduce. It's an onset controlled by the brain via hormone secretion. And the hormone that triggers puberty is called gonadotrophin releasing hormone, and it's a peptide of just 10 amino acids in length. And it's released by a few neurons in the hypothalamus, which then travels to another part of the brain called the pituitary gland, which then releases the hormones you'll be more familiar with. Releasing hormones is actually also used in the embryo. So when you're a fetus, the levels increase until after being born and stopping when the baby's about 4 to 6 months. So it triggers growth and rapid growth in the embryo to early baby. You then don't have much of it until you hit puberty, and it secretes again when the brain decides, and it is then released in pulses, so it goes up and down. It's job is to stimulate the pituitary gland. So as I said, it's released from the hypothalamus and travels to the pituitary, where it releases two of the hormones you're probably familiar with from GCSE, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and LH, luteinizing hormone. If you get lower frequency pulses of gonadotrophin releasing hormone, you release FSH, and in high frequency pulses you release LH. They are both classified as gonadotrophins because they cause changes in the gonads, which is the ovaries and testes, in other words, your reproductive organs. If we look at males particularly, even though this is what you may have previously studied as female hormone, males do need FSH and LH. So FSH triggers the testes to grow, and LH causes testosterone secretion from the Leydig cells, which are the main cells in the testes. So both are involved then in sperm production, and testosterone causes development of secondary sexual characteristics. So if we have a look here, the hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin releasing hormone. That goes to the pituitary. The pituitary then releases FSH, which causes the testes to grow, LH, which causes the release of testosterone, and then them together cause the secondary sexual characteristics changes. So hair growth in males, breaking of voice, muscle tone development, and the production of sperm, allowing reproduction. Females, the two hormones are also obviously very important. So ovary follicle stimulation is a key thing, and it stimulates the wall of the corpus luteum after ovulation. Corteus luteum is important because it secretes then two hormones which you'll be familiar about, estradiol and progesterone. And progesterone stimulates developmental changes for breasts to prepare for lactation. So you have this triggered effect. The gonadotrophin hormone is released from the pituitary gland, released from the hypothalamus, goes to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases these two hormones, which go to the ovaries, causing the corpus luteum to secrete estradiol and progesterone, which then have important roles later on in ovulation, but also in development of breast to allow lactation. The secondary sexual characteristics then are caused by the estradiol, and that is including breast development, widening of hips, pubic hair growth, and allowing the menstrual cycle to proceed, allowing fertilization of the egg. So how do the actual gametes get produced? Well, there are two types of gametes which are produced in gametogenesis, that's spermatozoa or oocytes. Obviously we're talking about humans, so we're not going to be talking about pollen. And this occurs in four main stages for both. We have mitosis occurring, so we have to have the production of large numbers of cells, cell growth occurring, then we have meiosis occurring, and then differentiation into cells. At spermatogenesis then, which is the production of sperm in males. So this occurs in the testes, which are a coiled mass of what we call seminiferous tubules. And you can see here, these are what we call the seminiferous tubules, these yellow bits in the testes. And these are between what we call between tubules that are interstitial gaps filled with testosterone from the Leydig cells. And the outer layer in the seminiferous tubing is called germinal epithelium, and this is where mitosis continually occurs before new cells migrate. Let's have a look at the stages and put some more sense to that. So stage one is when the germinal epithelial cells, which are diploid, endlessly divide by mitosis in the seminiferous tubing, making more diploid cells. They're constantly dividing, making more diploid cells. So at the moment, they're not making gametes, they're making 2N full 46 chromosome cells. The diploid cells then grow larger into primary spermatocytes and divide into secondary spermatocytes. So these 46 chromosome cells grow larger and then divide into now 23 chromosome cells, but they're still too big. They are not sperm cells at the moment. Each spermatocyte then carries out meiosis II to produce two spermatocytes, and the sperm associated with the Sertoli cells are called nurse cells and help sperm develop into spermatozoa, so they differentiate in the blue stage. The sperm then detach and eventually are carried out of the testes by the seminiferous tubule. Now, oogenesis is also obviously critical, and this is in females in the production of ovaries. So how does this happen then? Well, if we start off, we have something called an oogonium, which we have in this picture here. And the oogonium is an immature female reproductive cell that gives rise to the primary oocytes. So then we have a layer of follicle cells that surround the oocyte to make something called the primary follicle, which you can see here at number 2. The oocyte completes its first division of meiosis, and then it goes to what we call a primary follicle, number 3. And then a secondary follicle is formed when a follicle cell proliferates and a fluid-filled cavity develops. Secondary then stage of meiosis occurs. And you can see here it's developing and you get secondary oocyte as a result. This then leads to a mature follicle which bursts to release the egg in the process of ovulation, and then the wall of the follicle develops into the corteus luteum after ovulation and continues to release hormones which are then essential, as we talked about a few minutes ago, such as estradiol and progesterone. Of the ovaries is over a much greater timescale than sperm production in males. So what we have to be aware of is that the ovaries, this occurs in the ovaries in the first stage before the development of a fetus. And the outer layer of ovaries, called the germinal epithelium, undergoes mitosis during fetal development to produce the oogonium, the immature egg cells. So what we're saying is this is produced before the before the female is even born. These migrate and distribute into the cortex of the ovaries, so they'll be stored in the ovaries. At 5-month-old fetus, oocytes start to divide by meiosis and are surrounded by the follicle cells, forming the primary follicle. So this point here happens at 5-month-old fetus. Then at birth, you have over 400,000 of these primary oocytes, primary follicles, and primary follicles stop developing then until puberty, and no more are ever made. So what we're saying is that this point here is where you get before you're born, and at that point you have 400,000 primary follicles and you don't make any more later in life. And then it is the FSH that triggers the primary follicle to mature at each stage of the menstrual cycle from puberty onwards. So that will then happen due to FSH production at puberty. He has to compare the production of gametes in oogenesis or spermatogenesis, and you might need to consider the following things: how the gametes arise from meiosis, the rate of gamete production, the timing of the release of the eggs, the timing of production, and the amount of cytoplasm produced. So let's compare these just to finish. In terms of the gametes and how many are produced from meiosis, the spermatogenesis produces 4 gametes of sperm, per meiosis production. Oogenesis only produces 1 egg. The rate of production is millions per day in sperm. It is 1 per month in oogenesis. In the ejaculation is when the sperm are released, but on day 14 during ovulation in the oogenesis. The timing of production is from puberty onwards, and it takes 75 days to produce a sperm, whereas in oogenesis it is produced at fetus and completed and matured in the menstrual cycle. The amount of cytoplasm is very little to help the sperm swim towards the egg, but it's much more in the egg itself, because we want more to preserve food reserves for the embryo until implantation.